The knife was already at her throat when Elena Voss realized the wedding had turned into a trap. She had walked into the great hall of Blackthorn Castle only minutes before, her hands trembling under the borrowed silk of a wedding dress that did not belong to her, her heart pounding with a fear she refused to let show on her face. She had come to marry a stranger. She had not expected to be seized by one of his own guards before the ceremony even began. "Hold still," the guard growled, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to bruise. "The king wants to see what kind of woman thinks she can walk into his hall, wearing his mother's veil." Elena's mind raced. She had not chosen this veil. It had been handed to her by the pack elders that very morning, wrapped in old lace and older secrets, with instructions to wear it and say nothing. She had assumed it was tradition. She had not known it belonged to a dead queen. The great hall fell silent as the doors at the far end groaned open, and every head turned toward the man who entered. Alpha King Damien Blackthorn moved like a shadow given shape, dark and controlled, each step measured with the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with black hair pushed back from a face carved from something colder than stone. His eyes were a pale, unsettling gray, the color of a winter sky before snow. He did not look at the guests. He did not look at the flowers, or the silk banners hanging from the rafters in his family's colors. He looked only at Elena, and in that single glance, she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. "Release her," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall like the crack of a whip. The guard let go so fast that Elena stumbled, catching herself against a stone pillar. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and refused to let the fear inside her reach her face. Her father had taught her that much, at least, before sickness had taken the strength from his body and left her alone to pay off a debt she never agreed to. "You are not the bride I was promised," Damien said, circling her slowly, the way a wolf circles something it has not yet decided to trust. "The agreement was with the eldest daughter of the Voss line, a woman named Miriam." "My sister is dead," Elena said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. "She died 3 winters ago. I am the only daughter left." A murmur rippled through the crowd of pack members gathered along the walls, nobles and warriors and healers, all watching the exchange with the eager, hungry attention of people who loved a scandal more than they loved peace. Elena felt their eyes on her like 100 small blades. Damien stopped in front of her. Up close he was even more imposing, and Elena had to fight the urge to step back. His gray eyes moved over her face, her dress, the veil that had been forced onto her head that morning, and something in his expression hardened into contempt. "Then the elders lied to me," he said. "They sent me a replacement without my consent, dressed her in my mother's veil, and expected me to simply accept it." "I did not know about the veil," Elena said. "I did not ask for any of this. I was told my family owed your pack a debt, and that debt would end my father's suffering and protect the people who depend on our land. I came here because I had no other choice, not because I wanted a crown." For a moment, something flickered behind Damien's eyes, something that almost looked like curiosity. Then it vanished, replaced by the same cold mask he had worn since he entered the hall. "I do not care why you came," he said. "I care that I will not be forced into a mating with a woman I have never met, chosen for me by old men who think they can control the Alpha King, like a piece on a board. You will never be my Luna." The words landed like a physical blow. Elena heard the collective intake of breath from the crowd, felt the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her, and understood in that instant that her humiliation was about to become a story told in every corner of the kingdom by nightfall. "Take off the veil," Damien said. "It does not belong to you." Elena's hands moved to the delicate lace, and for a moment, pride warred with the instinct to simply obey and disappear. But something in her refused to let this man see her break. She lifted the veil from her head slowly, deliberately, as if it were her own choice and not his command, and held it out toward him. "Here," she said. "I never wanted to wear a dead woman's memory. I only wanted to keep my father alive." Something shifted in the hall. A few of the older pack members exchanged glances. An elderly woman near the front, dressed in the deep green robes of a pack healer, pressed a hand to her chest, as if the words had struck her somewhere tender. Damien did not take the veil. He looked at it, in Elena's outstretched hand, and for a heartbeat, his jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath his skin. Then he turned away. "Escort her out," he said to the guard, who had grabbed her earlier. "Send word to the Voss elders that their debt is not paid, and their daughter is not welcome in my pack." Wait. The voice that spoke was not Elena's. It belonged to an older man standing near the dais, dressed in robes marked with the silver crescent of a pack elder. His name, Elena would later learn, was Elder Corvin, and he had been the one to arrange the agreement with her family in the first place. "Alpha King, if you send her away, the debt remains unpaid, and the Voss lands fall under attack from the northern raiders within the month. Her family's territory guards the mountain pass. Without the protection your mating would provide, that pass falls, and the raiders reach our border towns within weeks." Damien's eyes narrowed. "Then find another solution, Elder. I did not build this pack into what it is, by making promises to strangers." "There is no other solution," Elder Corvin said, his voice steady despite the king's obvious anger. "The agreement was written and sealed by your own father before his death. You are bound by his word, whether or not you approve of the woman standing before you." The hall went utterly silent. Elena watched something dark pass over Damien's face at the mention of his father, a flicker of pain quickly buried beneath his usual control. She did not understand the history behind that flicker, not yet, but she filed it away, the way she filed away every piece of information that might help her survive whatever came next. Damien turned back to Elena, his gray eyes hard as ice. "You will stay," he said, and the words sounded less like an invitation and more like a punishment. "But do not mistake this for acceptance. You will not be given the title of Luna. You will not sit beside me at council. You will work in this castle like any other servant of this pack, and you will earn nothing from me beyond food and shelter, because that is more than your family's debt deserves." Elena's chest burned with humiliation, but underneath the sting, something else began to grow, small and stubborn and quiet. She thought of her father, weak and coughing in his bed at home, and of the mountain pass that protected hundreds of people who had never asked to be caught up in a war between pride and politics. She thought of her sister, gone too soon, and of the promise she had made at her grave to never let their family's name be spoken with pity again. "Fine," Elena said, lifting her chin even higher. "I did not come here for a crown, Alpha King. I came here to save my father and protect my people. If scrubbing your floors accomplishes that, then I will scrub every floor in this castle without complaint." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Even Damien seemed momentarily thrown off balance by her answer, as if he had expected tears, or pleading, or anger, and had received none of it. "Good," he said finally, recovering his composure. "Then we understand each other." He turned and walked away without another word, his guards falling into step behind him, leaving Elena standing alone in the middle of the great hall in a wedding dress that no longer meant anything, surrounded by whispers she refused to listen to. An hour later, a young pack member named Mira found her in the narrow servants' hallway behind the kitchens, still wearing the ruined wedding dress, staring blankly at a stone wall, as if it might offer some kind of answer. "You should change out of that before the kitchen staff sees you," Mira said gently, holding out a plain gray dress and a pair of worn boots. "They will only ask questions you do not want to answer tonight." Elena took the clothes without a word, disappearing behind a curtain to change. When she emerged, Mira studied her with an expression that was somewhere between pity and admiration. "I have never seen anyone speak to the Alpha King like that," Mira said. "Most people who anger him disappear from the castle within a day. You are either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Elena said, folding the wedding dress carefully despite everything, because even ruined things deserved some measure of respect. "Tell me something, Mira. Why did the elders choose me instead of finding another solution? There must be dozens of women in this kingdom who would gladly become Luna to an Alpha King." Mira hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if worried about who might be listening. "There are rumors," she said quietly, "about the king, about why he has not taken a Luna in the 3 years since his father died, despite pressure from every corner of the kingdom. Some say he cannot. Some say he will not. No one knows for certain, because he has never shifted into his wolf form in front of anyone since his parents were killed." Elena frowned. "Killed? I was told his father died of illness." "That is the story told to outsiders," Mira said, lowering her voice further. Within these walls, everyone knows it is not true, but no one speaks of it, not even to each other, because the king forbids it. Whatever happened that night, it changed him. He used to be different, they say, warmer. Now he is. She trailed off, searching for the right word. A wall, Elena offered. Mira nodded. A wall with a crown on top. Elena thought of the flicker of pain she had seen cross Damien's face when the elder mentioned his father's death, the way his composure had cracked for just a moment before he buried it again. There was a wound there, deep and old, and something told her it had never properly healed. She did not have time to dwell on it further, because a stern-faced woman in a kitchen apron appeared at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, clearly displeased at the sight of an idle new servant. "You must be the Voss girl," the woman said, her tone leaving no doubt about what she thought of the situation. "I am Greta, head of the kitchen staff. You will report to me every morning before sunrise, and you will not speak of what happened in the Great Hall today. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elena said, and though every part of her wanted to argue, to insist that she deserved better than kitchen work, after everything she had already sacrificed, she swallowed the protest whole. Survival first, pride later. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhausting labor. Elena scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, hauled buckets of water up steep stone stairs, and endured the whispered judgments of pack members who had watched her humiliation in the Great Hall and now delighted in reminding her of it whenever Greta was not looking. She said nothing in response. She simply worked, harder than anyone expected, until even the servants who mocked her began to run out of things to say. She saw Damien only rarely, always from a distance, always surrounded by advisors and guards, his expression as unreadable as it had been on the day they met. But she noticed things others seemed to miss, the way he sometimes stopped mid-stride near the windows, when moonlight spilled across the stone floor, his body going rigid for just a moment, before he forced himself to keep walking. The way his hands sometimes curled into fists at his sides for no visible reason, as if he were fighting something invisible that only he could feel. The way the castle's oldest wolves, the pack members who had served his father, watched him with a mixture of loyalty and quiet, unspoken worry. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Elena was sent to deliver a tray of food to the private study on the highest floor of the castle, a task usually reserved for the king's personal attendant, who had fallen ill that day. She climbed the winding stone stairs slowly, careful not to spill the contents of the tray, her mind occupied with thoughts of her father back home, and whether the healers she had paid for with the last of her family's savings were keeping their promises. She did not expect to find the study door standing open, or to hear the low, ragged sound of breathing coming from inside, like someone fighting to control something that refused to be controlled. Elena paused at the threshold, uncertain whether to knock or retreat. Through the gap in the door, she could see Damien standing near the tall window, his back to her, his shoulders shaking slightly, his hands braced against the stone windowsill as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The full moon hung heavy and silver in the sky beyond the glass, its light pouring across the room in a way that seemed almost cruel. "Alpha King?" Elena said softly, before she could stop herself. Damien's head snapped toward her, his gray eyes wild in a way she had never seen before, wide with something that looked disturbingly close to panic. For just a moment, before he composed himself, she saw a version of him that had nothing to do with crowns or castles or cold authority. She saw a man who was afraid. "Leave," he said, his voice rough, strained in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not name. "Now." But Elena did not leave. Instead, she set the tray down carefully on a nearby table, and took a small step into the room, driven by an instinct she did not fully understand, an instinct that told her this moment mattered more than any command he could give her. "You are in pain," she said quietly. "I am not blind, Alpha King. Something is happening to you, something you are hiding from everyone in this castle. Whatever it is, I am not going to run and tell anyone. I only came to bring your dinner." Damien stared at her for a long, tense moment, his chest rising and falling unevenly, his hands still gripping the windowsill as if he might fall apart without it. The moonlight caught the sharp lines of his face, and for the first time since she had arrived at the castle, Elena saw something beneath his cold exterior that looked almost human, something broken. "You should be afraid of me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Everyone should be. I am not afraid of you, Elena said, and she realized, with some surprise, that it was true. I think you are the one who is afraid. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them, filled with the distant sound of wind against the castle walls and the low, ragged rhythm of Damien's breathing as he fought to steady himself. Elena did not know what force compelled him to finally speak, whether it was exhaustion, or loneliness, or the strange, unexpected honesty of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I have not shifted into my wolf form in 3 years, he said quietly, the words seeming to cost him something enormous to admit. Every full moon, I stand at this window, and I wait to feel it, the change, the connection every wolf is supposed to have with the moon above them. And every full moon, there is nothing, only this. He gestured vaguely at his own trembling hands. Only this, hollow, aching absence, like something inside me, was taken and never returned. Elena's chest tightened with an emotion she had not expected to feel toward the man who had humiliated her in front of his entire pack only weeks before. Sympathy, understanding, something else she was not ready to name. Do you know why? She asked carefully. Damien's jaw tightened. No, he said, and I have stopped trying to find out. Before Elena could respond, a sudden, sharp gust of wind rattled the study window, and somewhere far below in the castle grounds, a wolf's mournful howl rose into the night, carrying across the darkness like a question no one could answer. Damien flinched at the sound, his entire body tensing, and for just a moment, Elena thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something faint and distant, like an ember buried deep beneath ash, waiting for the smallest spark to bring it back to life. She did not know it yet, standing there, in the moonlit study, with a king who claimed to feel nothing, but that faint ember was the beginning of everything that would follow, and neither of them was ready for what it would eventually become. Rain hammered against the castle walls the night Elena first heard the guards whispering about the northern border attack, and by the time the sun rose, half the pack's warriors had already left to answer the call. She learned the details from Mira, who always seemed to know everything happening within the castle walls before anyone else did. A raiding party had crossed into Blackthorn territory near the mountain pass, the very pass her family's lands were meant to protect, and several young warriors had been wounded defending a border village. The Alpha King himself had ridden out at dawn, refusing to send others in his place, despite his advisors' pleas that he was needed at the castle. He never sends others when the fighting is real, Mira said, kneading dough with more force than necessary as she spoke. Whatever else people say about him, no one can call him a coward. He leads from the front, every single time. Elena said nothing, though something uncomfortable twisted in her stomach at the thought of Damien riding into danger. She told herself it was only concern for the pack, for the people who depended on his protection, nothing more. She reminded herself of the humiliation in the Great Hall, the cold contempt in his eyes when he had looked at her like something unwanted. She had no reason to worry about a man who had made his feelings toward her painfully clear. And yet, 3 days later, when word arrived that the Alpha King had been gravely injured in a second skirmish along the border, Elena found herself abandoning her kitchen duties without permission, running toward the courtyard where the wounded were being carried in on makeshift stretchers. The scene that greeted her was chaos. Warriors bleeding from claw marks and blade wounds lay scattered across the courtyard, while healers moved between them, calling for supplies, shouting orders that blurred together into a single wall of noise. Elena scanned the wounded frantically, until she spotted him near the center of the commotion, blood soaking through the side of his tunic, his face pale beneath the dirt and grime of battle, but still standing, still barking orders at his warriors, even as his own legs threatened to give out beneath him. He needs to sit down before he collapses, an older healer muttered, though no one seemed brave enough to force the Alpha King to do anything he did not wish to do. Elena did not think. She simply moved, pushing through the crowd of warriors and healers until she reached him, catching his arm, just as his knees finally buckled beneath the weight of his injuries. "You are impossible," she said, half scolding, half terrified, as she helped guide him toward a nearby bench before he could fall to the stone ground. "Even a king bleeds, Alpha King. Even a king needs rest." Damien's gray eyes found hers, glazed slightly with pain and exhaustion, and for a moment, something almost like surprise flickered across his face at finding her there among the chaos. "You should not be here," he said, though his voice lacked its usual sharp edge, worn thin by injury and blood loss. "And yet, here I am," Elena said, tearing a strip of clean cloth from her apron and pressing it firmly against the wound at his side, ignoring his sharp hiss of pain. "Hold still, unless you would prefer to bleed to death in front of your entire pack." Something that might have been a laugh, or possibly a groan of pain, escaped him, and despite everything, Elena found herself fighting back a small, unexpected smile. The healers eventually took over, ushering Damien inside to be properly treated, and Elena returned to her kitchen duties with her heart still pounding, unsettled by how quickly instinct had overridden every reason she had to keep her distance from him. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the same thing for the next several days, even as she found reasons to walk past the healer's chambers, more often than necessary, even as she found herself listening for news of his recovery, with an attentiveness she could not quite explain. It was nearly a week later, while delivering fresh linens to the upper floors, that Elena stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. The door to what had once belonged to the late Queen's private study stood slightly ajar, unused, and mostly forgotten by the rest of the castle since the previous royal family's death. Curiosity, always Elena's weakness, drew her closer, and she peered inside to find dust-covered shelves lined with old books and a single wooden chest sitting open beneath the window, its contents spilling out across the floor, as if someone had searched through it in a hurry and never returned to put things back in order. Among the scattered papers, a leather journal caught her eye, its cover worn soft with age, the initials carved into the front reading simply, E.B. Elena knew she should leave it untouched. She knew whatever secrets belonged to a dead queen were not hers to uncover. But something about the desperate way Damien had looked at her that night in his study, the raw fear in his voice as he spoke of his missing wolf, pulled her forward despite every warning bell ringing in her mind. She knelt down and opened the journal carefully, scanning the elegant, looping handwriting inside. The early pages spoke of ordinary things, a mother's love for her young son, small memories of his childhood laughter, echoing through castle halls that now felt so cold and silent. But as Elena turned the pages further, the entries grew increasingly urgent, increasingly afraid, filled with references to a growing darkness surrounding their family, an ancient debt owed by the Blackthorn bloodline to forces the Queen refused to name directly, even in her private writing. One entry, dated only weeks before what Elena now understood must have been the Queen's death, made her blood run cold. "The binding ritual is our only choice if we cannot defeat them tonight," the entry read. "If they come for Damien as they came for his father's line before him, his wolf must be hidden where the curse cannot reach it. I pray we never need to use it. I pray my son never has to live without the other half of his soul. But if the night comes when we have no other option, know this, my darling boy, wherever you are reading this, your wolf is not gone. It sleeps, and only a bond stronger than the curse itself can wake it again." Elena's hands trembled as she read the words a second time, her heart pounding with a mixture of horror and understanding. Damien's missing wolf was not some unexplained illness, some private weakness he was too proud to seek help for. It had been deliberately bound, hidden away by his own mother, to protect him from something far darker than Elena had imagined, something tied to an old family curse no one in the castle dared speak of openly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside sent Elena scrambling to close the journal and tuck it beneath her arm, her mind racing. She barely made it out of the study and around the corner before a guard rounded the corridor, and she pressed herself against the stone wall, heart hammering, until his footsteps faded into the distance. She knew she should return the journal exactly where she found it. She knew reading a dead queen's private words, uncovering secrets that clearly had been hidden for good reason, was a dangerous line to cross in a castle full of people who already viewed her with suspicion. But the thought of Damien standing alone at that window every full moon, believing himself broken beyond repair, unaware that his mother had died trying to protect the very thing he mourned losing, was more than Elena could simply walk away from. That night, unable to sleep, she sat by the small candle in her narrow servant's room and read the journal from beginning to end, piecing together fragments of a story far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Blackthorn bloodline carried an old curse, tied to a betrayal generations past, one that targeted the family's connection to their wolves specifically, weakening them at their most vulnerable moments. The Queen had discovered enemies closing in on their family, enemies she believed had already caused the death of Damien's grandfather years before, under circumstances the official records called an unfortunate accident. To protect her son from a similar fate, she had performed an ancient binding ritual, sealing away Damien's wolf where the curse could not touch it, intending to reverse it once the danger had passed. But the Queen had never gotten the chance. Whatever happened on the night of her death, whatever the official story claimed about illness and misfortune, the truth buried in her private journal painted a far more sinister picture, one involving betrayal from within their own pack, a betrayal that had never been properly investigated or resolved. Elena closed the journal as the first gray light of dawn crept through her small window, exhaustion pulling at her eyes, but her mind far too alert to consider sleep. She thought of Damien's trembling hands gripping the windowsill, the raw fear in his voice as he described the hollow absence inside himself, and she understood, with sudden and unshakable clarity, that he had spent 3 years grieving something his own mother had given her life trying to protect. He deserved to know the truth, but telling him meant admitting she had trespassed into private, forbidden territory, and risking whatever fragile trust had begun to form between them since that night in his study. It also meant confronting whoever within the pack might still pose a danger to him, people who had already succeeded once in tearing his family apart, and might not hesitate to try again if they discovered their secrets had been uncovered. Elena tucked the journal carefully beneath a loose floorboard beneath her narrow bed, deciding she needed more information before she risked revealing what she had found. She needed to understand exactly what had happened the night the old Queen died, and more importantly, she needed to figure out who among the pack's trusted advisors and warriors might still be loyal to whatever dark forces had targeted the Blackthorn family in the first place. It was a dangerous decision, one that would pull her deeper into the castle's hidden politics than she had ever intended to go. But as she finally allowed herself a few hours of restless sleep before the morning's kitchen duties began, Elena could not shake the feeling that fate, or something very close to it, had placed that journal in her path for a reason. Whatever waited ahead, she was no longer simply a servant paying off her family's debt. She had become something else entirely, whether she wanted the responsibility or not. The only person in Blackthorn Castle who knew the truth about their king's missing wolf, and possibly the only person who could help him get it back. Smoke rose from the burning watchtower before Elena even understood why the castle bells were ringing. She had been carrying baskets of bread down to the lower storerooms when the alarm bells began their frantic clanging, a sound she had never heard before but understood instantly, in the deepest, oldest part of her, as a warning of danger. Warriors poured out of the barracks, pulling on armor as they ran, shouting orders to one another, about a second raiding party striking closer to the castle than anyone expected, cutting through the eastern woods under cover of a moonless night. Elena should have run for the safety of the inner castle walls, like the other servants. Instead, she found herself following the crowd of warriors toward the eastern gate, driven by a need to understand what was happening, to see for herself whether Damien had ridden out again, despite still healing from his previous injuries. He had. Of course he had. She spotted him near the front lines through the chaos of firelight and shouting, directing warriors with sharp, precise commands, his sword already drawn, his stance steady despite the wound in his side that Elena knew had not fully healed. Fear seized her chest, sharp and unexpected, watching him move toward the fighting, with the same reckless disregard for his own safety that had nearly gotten him killed the last time. The battle unfolded faster than Elena could track, warriors from both sides clashing in the shadows beyond the gate, the air filled with the sounds of steel and snarling and desperate shouts. She pressed herself against the stone wall near the gate, watching in horror as a young wounded soldier stumbled backward through the chaos, collapsing near her feet, blood pouring from a gash across his shoulder, his enemy closing in for a final blow. Elena did not think. She grabbed the fallen soldier's dropped shield and threw herself between him and the approaching raider, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, her mind screaming that she had no training, no weapon skill, nothing to offer except her own body as a barrier. The raider's blade came down toward her, and for one horrifying moment, Elena was certain she was about to die protecting a stranger in a war she had never wanted any part of. Then Damien was there, He moved faster than she had ever seen anyone move, crossing the distance between them in the span of a single heartbeat, his sword meeting the raider's blade with a force that sent sparks scattering into the darkness. He fought with a controlled, brutal efficiency that spoke of years of discipline, driving the attacker back step by step until the man finally broke and fled into the darkness of the tree line, unwilling to face the Alpha King's fury any longer. The moment the immediate danger passed, Damien turned to Elena, his gray eyes wild, with an emotion she had never seen from him before, something raw and unguarded that looked disturbingly close to terror. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders, his gaze sweeping over her frantically, as if searching for wounds. "What were you thinking, running into the middle of a battle with no training and no weapon?" "He was going to die," Elena said, gesturing toward the wounded soldier still slumped against the wall behind her, breathing shallowly, but alive. "I could not just stand there and watch." Something in Damien's expression shifted, the fear giving way to something else entirely, something Elena did not have time to name before a sudden movement in the darkness beyond them caught her attention. A second attacker, one who had circled around during the chaos, lunged from the shadows directly toward Damien's unguarded back. Elena reacted on pure instinct, remembering the old story her grandmother used to tell about mate bonds and the ancient magic said to surround them, a desperate half-forgotten piece of folklore that claimed a mate's kiss could ward off dark magic and disrupt an attacker's aim in moments of true danger. She did not stop to consider whether the tale was true, whether it even applied to two people who were not truly bonded. She simply reached up, grabbed the front of Damien's tunic, and kissed him. It was meant to be nothing more than a desperate distraction, a wild gamble born from fear and folklore, and the split-second belief that anything might be worth trying if it kept him alive. But the moment her lips met his, something extraordinary happened. A pulse of warmth surged through Elena's chest, spreading outward like ripples across still water, and beneath her hands, she felt Damien go rigid with shock, his entire body tensing, as if struck by lightning. The attacker's blade, which had been aimed with lethal precision toward Damien's exposed back, veered wildly off course at the last possible second, as though some invisible force had knocked the man off balance, sending his weapon clattering harmlessly against the stone wall instead of finding its target. Elena pulled back, breathless and stunned by what had just happened, staring up at Damien with wide eyes. He stared back at her, his expression unreadable, his breathing ragged, one hand pressed against his own chest, as though something inside him had shifted violently out of place. "What did you just do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with something that sounded almost like fear. "I do not know," Elena admitted honestly. "There is an old story about mate bonds warding off dark magic in moments of danger. I did not think it would actually work. I did not think it could work, not for us." Before either of them could say anything further, more warriors arrived to finish driving off the remaining raiders, and the chaotic aftermath of battle swept them both back into duty and urgency, leaving no room for further conversation about what had just passed between them. But Elena noticed, even amid the confusion of tending wounded soldiers and securing the gate, that Damien kept glancing toward her throughout the rest of the night, his expression troubled, his hand occasionally pressing against his chest, as though something inside him refused to settle back into its familiar hollow silence. It was nearly dawn by the time the wounded had all been carried inside and the immediate danger had passed. Elena found herself exhausted beyond measure, her hands stained with blood that was not her own, her borrowed apron torn in several places from the night's chaos. She was making her way back toward the servants' quarters when a firm hand caught her arm, pulling her gently but insistently into a quiet alcove, away from the bustling activity of the recovering castle. Damien stood before her, having changed out of his battle armor into a simple dark tunic, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight, though something in his eyes seemed different than she had ever seen before, less guarded, more uncertain. "I need to understand what happened tonight," he said quietly. "Since the moment your lips touched mine, I have felt something I have not felt in 3 years, a presence, faint but undeniable, stirring somewhere deep inside me, like an ember that refuses to fully die, despite years of being smothered." Elena's breath caught. She thought of the Queen's journal hidden beneath her floorboard, of the words written in that desperate, loving hand, "Only a bond stronger than the curse itself can wake it again." She wanted, desperately, to tell him everything she had discovered, to explain the binding ritual, and the ancient family curse, and the sacrifice his mother had made to protect him. But something held her back, an instinct that warned her the timing was not yet right, that revealing everything now, in the raw and vulnerable aftermath of battle, might do more harm than good, before she fully understood the danger surrounding them both. Perhaps the old stories carry more truth than either of us realized, Elena said carefully instead, choosing her words with caution. Perhaps there is more to fated bonds than either of us has been willing to believe. Damien studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. "I called you weak the day you arrived," he said quietly. "I said you would never be my Luna, and I meant every word of it at the time. But tonight, you threw yourself between a stranger and death without a moment's hesitation, and somehow, impossibly, your kiss reached a part of me that 3 years of grief and guilt could not touch." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his usually guarded expression. "I do not know what to make of that anymore." "You do not need to make anything of it tonight," Elena said gently, surprising herself with the tenderness in her own voice. "We are both exhausted, and this castle has enough secrets and complications, without adding more confusion to an already difficult night. But I will say this, Alpha King, whatever I am to you, servant or stranger or something else entirely, I did not kiss you tonight because of some old folktale about mate bonds. I kissed you because in that moment, saving your life mattered more to me than anything else, including my own pride." Something shifted in Damien's expression at her words, the careful walls he kept around himself cracking just slightly further, though he quickly composed himself before whatever vulnerable thought had crossed his mind could fully surface. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You have more than earned it tonight." Elena nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her once more, before she had taken more than a few steps. "Elena." It was the first time he had ever used her name, instead of some cold, formal title, and the sound of it in his low, rough voice sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you. For tonight. For all of it." She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something caught between gratitude and confusion, and something else entirely, something that looked dangerously close to the beginning of hope. "You are welcome, Alpha King," she said softly, before finally continuing on toward the servants' quarters, leaving him standing alone in the quiet alcove, one hand still pressed absently against his chest, as if trying to hold on to whatever faint warmth had stirred there, since the moment her lips had touched his. Neither of them spoke of the kiss again in the days that followed, though Elena noticed a subtle shift in how Damien treated her afterward. He no longer looked at her with the cold contempt of their first meeting. Instead, his gray eyes seemed to search her face whenever their paths crossed in the castle halls, as though he were trying to solve some puzzle he did not yet have all the pieces to understand. He began finding small, seemingly insignificant reasons to speak with her, asking after her father's health, inquiring whether the kitchen staff treated her fairly, small gestures that meant little on their own but together, painted the picture of a man whose careful indifference was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to crack. Elena told herself she needed to remain cautious, that whatever strange connection had sparked between them during that desperate moment of battle did not erase the danger surrounding his family, the ancient curse his mother had died trying to protect him from, or the unknown enemies who might still be watching from within the pack's own walls. But despite every warning she gave herself, she could not deny the small, stubborn hope beginning to bloom in her chest, the quiet possibility that perhaps she had been brought to Blackthorn Castle for reasons far greater than settling an old family debt. She did not yet know how right she was, nor how much danger still lay ahead before that hope could ever be allowed to fully bloom. The council chamber fell silent the moment Damien announced that Elena would be moved from the servants' quarters to a room near his own private wing, ostensibly for what he called security reasons, following the recent border attacks. Elena stood near the back of the chamber, arms crossed, watching the ripple of surprise and suspicion pass across the faces of the gathered advisors and elders. She understood immediately that this decision would not be well received, and she was proven right within seconds. "With respect, Alpha King," Elder Corvin said carefully, though his tone carried clear reservation. "The Voss girl is a servant, paying a family debt, not a member of your personal guard, requiring proximity to your private chambers. Such an arrangement will raise questions among the pack. Let it raise questions, Damien said flatly, his gray eyes daring anyone else at the table to challenge him further. Since the border attack, there have been reports of unfamiliar scents near the servants' quarters at night, unexplained movements along that section of the castle walls. I would rather address any potential threat directly than wait for something worse to happen, because I ignored the warning signs. Elena knew, even as the excuse left his mouth, that it was only partially true. There had indeed been strange reports from the night guards, whispers of shadows moving where they should not be, but she suspected the deeper truth was something Damien himself was not yet ready to admit, even to his own advisors. Whatever connection had sparked between them since that desperate kiss during the battle continued to grow, quiet and undeniable, and Elena did not think either of them fully understood what to do with it. The council eventually relented, though not without lingering glances of suspicion directed her way, as the meeting concluded. Elena remained behind as the chamber emptied, waiting until only she and Damien remained. "You did not need to move me," she said, once the heavy doors closed behind the last departing advisor. "I have managed well enough in the servants' quarters." "I know," Damien said, moving to stand near the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "But since the night of the attack, I have felt something different whenever you are near. A kind of quiet warmth settling over the emptiness inside me that has not existed in 3 years. I do not fully understand it, and I am not entirely comfortable admitting how much it unsettles me, but I find myself unwilling to simply ignore it any longer." Elena moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice, so different from the cold command he had used the day they first met. "What exactly do you feel?" she asked gently. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "A pull," he said finally, "faint but constant, like a thread stretched between us, that grows tighter whenever you are nearby. I have spent 3 years believing my wolf was simply gone, lost to whatever tragedy took my parents. But since that kiss, I feel it stirring, faint and distant, like something waking slowly from a very long sleep." Elena's chest tightened with the weight of what she knew and had not yet told him. She thought again of the journal hidden beneath her floorboard, of his mother's desperate, loving words about binding rituals and ancient curses, and the growing certainty that Damien deserved the truth sooner rather than later. But something continued to hold her back, a cautious instinct warning her that revealing such dangerous secrets before she understood exactly who among the pack's leadership might still pose a threat could put them both in far greater danger than simply waiting a little longer. "Perhaps some bonds simply take time to fully awaken," she said instead, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps whatever was taken from you is not gone forever, only waiting for the right moment to return." Something in Damien's expression softened at her words, though a shadow of old grief still lingered behind his eyes. "You speak as though you know something I do not," he said quietly, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I only know what my instincts tell me," Elena said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the complete truth. "And my instincts tell me that whatever happened to you, whatever took your wolf away, was not something you deserved. You are not broken, Alpha King. You are simply waiting." Damien's gaze lingered on her for a long, charged moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither of them seemed ready to name aloud. Finally, he cleared his throat and stepped back, retreating slightly behind the careful composure he wore so easily in front of others. "You should settle into your new quarters before evening," he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar formality, though his eyes remained soft. "I will have Mira assist you with the arrangements." Elena nodded, understanding the conversation had reached its natural end, though the warmth lingering in her chest told her something significant had shifted between them, regardless of how quickly he retreated back behind his usual walls. Her new quarters, situated just down the hall from Damien's private wing, were far more comfortable than the narrow servants' room she had grown accustomed to, though Elena found herself feeling strangely uneasy amid the unfamiliar luxury. That evening, as she unpacked her few belongings, a soft knock at her door revealed Mira standing in the hallway, her expression troubled. "You should know something," Mira said quietly, glancing over her shoulder, before slipping inside and closing the door behind her. Lord Cassian Hale arrived at the castle this afternoon, requesting an audience with the Alpha King. He has been pushing for months to arrange a political marriage between the king and his own cousin, hoping to secure influence over the Blackthorn pack through mating ties. Since your arrival, and especially since the king moved you closer to his private wing, Cassian has grown increasingly vocal about what he calls dangerous distractions threatening the pack's stability. Elena frowned, recalling the tension she had noticed among certain advisors during the council meeting. "Is Cassian dangerous?" she asked. "He is ambitious," Mira said carefully, "and ambitious men rarely enjoy watching their carefully laid plans unravel because of unexpected complications. I would advise caution, Elena. Whatever is growing between you and the Alpha King, Cassian will see it as a threat to be eliminated, one way or another." Elena thought of the Queen's journal once more, of the ancient curse targeting the Blackthorn bloodline, of unknown enemies who had already succeeded once in tearing the family apart. She wondered, with a growing sense of unease, whether Cassian's ambition and the darker forces mentioned in the late Queen's writing might somehow be connected, or whether they were simply two separate dangers now converging on Damien from different directions at the worst possible time. Either way, she understood one thing, with sudden and unshakable clarity. Whatever fragile connection had begun growing between herself and the Alpha King, it was no longer a private matter contained within castle walls. It had become something visible, something threatening enough to draw the attention of powerful men with dangerous ambitions, and Elena knew, with a chill settling deep in her chest, that the coming days would test exactly how strong that fragile, awakening bond truly was. Lord Cassian Hale arrived at dinner that evening wearing the confident smile of a man who believed every room he entered already belonged to him. Elena watched him from her seat near the far end of the long dining table, studying the way he carried himself, the easy charm in his voice as he greeted the assembled pack elders, the sharp calculation hiding just beneath his friendly exterior, whenever his gaze flicked toward Damien, or, more pointedly, toward her. "Alpha King," Cassian said smoothly, taking the seat directly across from Damien without waiting for an invitation. "It has been too long since I last visited Blackthorn Castle. I see much has changed since then." His eyes moved deliberately toward Elena, lingering just long enough to make his meaning clear to everyone at the table. "Lord Cassian," Damien replied, his tone carefully neutral, though Elena noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Uneventful enough," Cassian said, reaching for his wineglass with unhurried ease. "Though I confess I was surprised to hear rumors reaching my own territory, about a servant girl being moved into private quarters near the Alpha King's own wing. Surely there are more appropriate arrangements for a debt payment. Wouldn't you agree, my lord?" The table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give Cassian the satisfaction of seeing her rattled, though her heart pounded uncomfortably beneath her calm exterior. "Matters of castle security are my concern, not yours, Lord Cassian," Damien said, his voice edged with warning. "I would advise you to focus on the matters that actually fall within your jurisdiction." Cassian's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered behind his eyes. "Of course, Alpha King. I only raised the matter out of concern for the pack's stability. A king's choices reflect on all of us, after all, and my cousin Lysandra has waited patiently for months, hoping for the honor of an audience regarding a proper political alliance, one that would strengthen ties between our territories rather than complicate them." Elena felt the weight of every eye at the table shift briefly toward her, and she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what game Cassian was playing. He intended to publicly frame her presence as an obstacle to a beneficial political marriage, planting seeds of doubt among the pack's leadership that would slowly grow into open opposition if left unchallenged. The dinner continued with careful, tense conversation, Cassian steering the discussion repeatedly toward questions of pack loyalty, tradition, and the dangers of allowing personal feelings to interfere with strategic decisions. Elena said little throughout the meal, choosing instead to observe, gathering information about the man who so clearly viewed her as an inconvenience, standing between himself and greater influence over the Blackthorn pack. It was only after the meal ended, as guests began retiring for the evening, that Cassian finally approached her directly, catching her alone in a quiet hallway as she made her way back toward her quarters. "You should understand something, Miss Voss," he said, his charming public demeanor dropping away entirely now that no one else remained to witness the exchange. Whatever fascination the Alpha King currently holds for you will not last. Men like Damien Blackthorne are shaped by duty and legacy, not fleeting attraction to servants who happen to catch his attention during a moment of weakness. When he comes to his senses, and he will, I intend to be standing exactly where I belong, securing my family's rightful place at the head of this pack's future. Is that a threat, Lord Cassian? Elena asked, refusing to let the tremor of unease in her chest reach her voice. It is a fact, Cassian said smoothly. I have spent years building the connections necessary to secure my cousin's place beside the Alpha King. I will not allow a debt-paying servant to undo that work simply because she managed to catch his eye during a moment of vulnerability. Consider this a friendly warning, Miss Voss. Return to your kitchen duties, and this can end without unpleasantness for anyone involved. Elena held his gaze steadily, refusing to back down despite the cold warning in his tone. I did not ask to be here, Lord Cassian, and I certainly did not ask for whatever is happening between myself and the Alpha King. But I will not be threatened into abandoning my place simply because it inconveniences your ambitions. Something dangerous flickered behind Cassian's eyes before he composed himself once more, his charming mask sliding back into place as easily as it had dropped away moments before. We shall see how long that courage lasts, he said, before turning and disappearing down the corridor, leaving Elena standing alone, with her heart pounding and a growing sense of dread settling deep in her chest. She found Damien later that night in his study, standing near the same window where she had first witnessed his hidden pain weeks before. He turned as she entered, his gray eyes immediately sharpening with concern at whatever expression must have shown on her face. What happened? He asked, closing the distance between them quickly. Elena hesitated only briefly before deciding honesty served her better than silence. She recounted her conversation with Cassian, watching Damien's jaw tighten with barely restrained anger as she spoke. He has no authority to threaten you, Damien said, his voice low and dangerous. I will speak with him myself. That is not necessary, Elena said quickly, placing a hand gently on his arm to stop him from storming off immediately. I do not need you to fight my battles, Alpha King. I only wanted you to understand what kind of man you are dealing with, so you are not caught unprepared by whatever he attempts next. Damien's anger softened slightly beneath her touch, though the tension in his shoulders remained. You continue to surprise me, he said quietly. Most people in this castle would have run to me immediately, expecting protection. You came instead to warn me of danger, even when the danger was aimed at yourself. Perhaps I have grown tired of being underestimated, Elena said, a small, tired smile touching her lips despite the tension of the evening. Damien studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing across his usually careful expression. Cassian is not wrong about one thing, he said quietly. Whatever is happening between us has moved beyond something I can simply dismiss or ignore, no matter how much easier that might make things. I do not know what this connection means yet, or where it will lead us, but I know I have no intention of allowing his ambitions, or anyone else's, to dictate what happens next. Elena's heart swelled with something warm and dangerous, a feeling she had been trying carefully to keep contained since that desperate kiss during the battle weeks before. Then we face whatever comes next together, she said softly. Damien reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek longer than necessary. Together, he agreed quietly, the word carrying more weight than either of them had expected. Neither of them noticed the shadow moving silently away from the study door outside, nor the quiet, calculating smile that spread across Cassian's face as he disappeared back into the darkened castle corridors, already planning his next move in a game far more dangerous than either Elena or Damien yet understood. Whispers followed Elena through the castle halls within days. Quiet accusations passed between servants and warriors alike, claiming she had bewitched the Alpha King through forbidden means, that her presence threatened the pack's safety rather than protecting it. Elena recognized Cassian's careful hand behind every rumor, though she had no proof to bring before the council, nothing beyond her own certainty that his ambition had found a new, quieter weapon to wield against her. He is turning the pack against you, Mira warned one morning, her voice tight with worry as she helped Elena prepare for the day. Slowly, carefully, so no single accusation seemed significant enough to challenge directly. But together, they paint a picture the elders cannot easily ignore. Elena had already noticed the shift herself, the way conversations quieted whenever she entered a room, the suspicious glances from pack members, who had once simply pitied her, now watching her instead with open distrust. She said nothing of it to Damien, unwilling to add further weight to his already heavy responsibilities, though she suspected he noticed the changing atmosphere regardless. Matters came to a dangerous head during a formal gathering held in the castle's grand courtyard, meant to celebrate the pack's recent victory against the Northern Raiders. Elena stood near the edge of the celebration, quietly observing the festivities from a respectful distance, when Cassian approached the gathered crowd with a triumphant expression that immediately set her nerves on edge. "Alpha King," Cassian announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the courtyard. "I bring troubling news that cannot wait. My scouts have uncovered evidence suggesting Miss Voss maintains secret correspondence with parties hostile to this pack, individuals connected to the very raiders who attacked our borders weeks ago." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as dozens of eyes turned toward her, suspicion and fear replacing whatever goodwill she had slowly begun earning among the pack members over the past weeks. "That is a lie," Elena said, stepping forward despite the way her voice trembled with barely controlled anger. "I have no connection to any raiders, hostile or otherwise." Cassian produced a folded letter with practiced ease, holding it aloft for the gathered crowd to see. "This was discovered near the servants' quarters, bearing your family's seal, containing references to border weaknesses and patrol schedules that would prove invaluable to any enemy planning an attack." Elena's stomach twisted with horror as murmurs of outrage spread through the courtyard. She had never seen the letter before in her life, yet the elegant script and familiar seal made it clear that someone had gone to considerable trouble crafting a convincing forgery. "I have never written such a letter," she said desperately, searching the crowd for any sign of support, and finding only wary, uncertain faces staring back at her. Damien stepped forward before the situation could escalate further, his expression carefully controlled, despite the storm clearly brewing behind his gray eyes. "Bring the letter to me," he commanded, and Cassian, though visibly reluctant, had little choice but to comply in front of the assembled crowd. Damien studied the forged letter carefully, his jaw tightening with each passing moment. "This seal is incorrect," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "The Voss family seal carries a small crescent mark in the lower corner, a detail easily overlooked by anyone unfamiliar with the family's true history, but unmistakable to those who have studied it properly." He held the letter up for the nearest elders to examine. "This forgery is missing that mark entirely." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the crowd, as several elders leaned forward to confirm the missing detail. Elena felt a rush of relief flood through her, though it was quickly followed by fresh unease, as Cassian's expression flickered with barely concealed fury, before he composed himself once more. "Perhaps my scouts were simply mistaken about the letter's origin," Cassian said smoothly, though the tension in his voice betrayed his obvious frustration at having his scheme so publicly unraveled. "I apologize for any distress caused by the misunderstanding." "See that such mistakes do not happen again, Lord Cassian," Damien said, his voice carrying a warning edge that left little room for misinterpretation. "I will not tolerate false accusations being used as weapons within my own pack, regardless of who benefits from the resulting chaos." The celebration resumed slowly, though the atmosphere remained tense, and Elena noticed several pack members continuing to watch her with lingering suspicion, despite the letter's forgery being exposed. Cassian's whispered campaign had already done its damage, planting seeds of doubt that a single revealed lie could not fully undo. Later that evening, Damien found Elena sitting alone near the castle's eastern garden, staring out at the darkening sky with troubled eyes. "You knew that letter was false immediately," she said quietly as he approached, without turning to look at him. "How?" "Because I have made it my business to understand every detail about you since the moment you arrived at this castle," Damien admitted, settling onto the stone bench beside her. "I studied your family's history carefully after our first meeting, back when I still believed you might be a threat requiring careful monitoring. I know your family seal. I know the crescent mark your grandfather added generations ago, to honor an old promise made to this very pack." Elena turned to study him, surprised by the admission. "You investigated my family before you ever gave me a chance to prove myself." "I did," Damien said, meeting her gaze steadily. And I regret the assumptions I made about you during those early days, more than you likely realize. You have proven yourself far braver and more honorable than most pack members born and raised within these walls. Elena's chest tightened with emotion at his words, though the danger of the day's events still weighed heavily on her mind. Cassian will not stop, she said. He proved today that he is willing to fabricate evidence and manipulate the entire pack against me, if it serves his ambitions. Whatever comes next, it will likely be worse. Damien's expression darkened with grim determination. Then we prepare for worse, he said. I will not allow him to tear apart everything slowly beginning to heal within this pack, and within myself, simply because his own ambitions have been threatened by circumstances beyond his control. He reached over, gently taking her hand in his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt far more significant than either of them dared to acknowledge aloud. Elena felt the same faint warmth she had experienced during their first kiss, stirring quietly between them once more, steady and undeniable, despite the danger surrounding them. Whatever happens next, Damien said quietly, know that I stand beside you now, Elena. Not out of obligation, and not out of some ancient debt owed to your family. I stand beside you because I choose to, and because whatever this connection is between us, I no longer wish to fight against it. Elena squeezed his hand gently, drawing strength from the quiet certainty in his voice, though a small, persistent worry continued nagging at the back of her mind. Cassian's schemes had grown bolder, more desperate, and Elena suspected, with a chill of unease she could not quite shake, that his next move would prove far more dangerous than a simple forged letter. She was right to worry. Neither of them yet understood how close they stood to an ambush that would finally shatter the last remnants of the barrier Damien had built around his own broken heart. The message arrived just after midday, carried by a breathless young messenger, claiming Elena's father had taken a sudden turn for the worse and needed her presence immediately, at a healer's cottage, located just beyond the castle's eastern boundary. Elena did not stop to question the request, her heart seizing with fear at the thought of losing her father after everything she had already sacrificed to protect him. She gathered her cloak and slipped out through a side gate before anyone could stop her, following the messenger's directions along a narrow forest path she had never traveled before, her mind consumed entirely by worry rather than caution. She should have noticed the silence of the forest sooner, the absence of birdsong, the way the messenger's pace grew increasingly hurried and evasive the deeper they traveled into unfamiliar woods. By the time she finally understood something was terribly wrong, it was already too late. 4 armed men emerged from the surrounding trees, surrounding her before she could turn to flee, their faces hard and unfamiliar beneath the shadows of the darkening canopy above. The messenger who had led her into the trap simply melted away into the underbrush, his task apparently complete. Lord Cassian sends his regards, one of the men said with a cruel smile, stepping closer as Elena backed against a nearby tree, her mind racing for any possible escape. He thought it best to remove certain complications before they grew too difficult to manage. My father, Elena said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to remain steady. Is he even truly ill? Your father is perfectly well, the man said dismissively. Unlike you, who will shortly become a very convenient lesson to the Alpha King about the dangers of allowing sentiment to interfere with proper political alliances. Elena's mind raced desperately for any option beyond the 4 armed men closing in around her, but before she could formulate any plan, a low, furious growl echoed through the surrounding trees, followed instantly by the sound of powerful footsteps crashing through the underbrush toward them. Damien burst through the tree line with a fury Elena had never witnessed before, his eyes blazing with barely restrained rage as he took in the scene before him. He moved with terrifying speed and precision, disarming the nearest attacker before the man could even react, his controlled fighting from previous battles replaced now by something far more primal and desperate. The remaining attackers scattered quickly once they realized the Alpha King himself had discovered their ambush, fleeing into the surrounding forest rather than risk facing his wrath directly. Damien did not pursue them, choosing instead to cross the small clearing immediately toward Elena, his hands trembling slightly as he gently checked her for any injuries. How did you find me? Elena asked, still breathless with shock and relief. I felt something, Damien admitted, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. A sharp, sudden fear that was not entirely my own, pulling me toward you with a certainty I could not ignore. I do not fully understand it, but I trusted it completely. Elena's chest ached with overwhelming relief and gratitude, the events of the past several minutes finally catching up with her trembling body. Without fully deciding to do so, she closed the remaining distance between them and kissed him, deeply and desperately, pouring every bit of fear and relief and unspoken affection into the gesture. This time, Damien did not remain frozen or startled by the contact. He kissed her back fiercely, one hand cradling the back of her head, while the other wrapped firmly around her waist, pulling her closer, as though he could not bear to allow any further distance between them. The warmth that spread through Elena's chest during this kiss felt far stronger than anything she had experienced before, a powerful surge of energy that seemed to pulse outward from where their bodies pressed together, filling the surrounding clearing with a faint, golden shimmer that neither of them could easily explain. Damien broke away first, breathing heavily, his gray eyes wide with astonishment as he pressed a hand against his own chest. "I felt that," he said, his voice filled with disbelief, not faintly, not distantly, but strongly, undeniably, as though something inside me finally cracked open after years of silence. "Your wolf?" Elena asked softly, hardly daring to hope. "Something," Damien said, still visibly shaken by the intensity of whatever had just occurred between them. "Something powerful, closer to the surface than it has been in 3 long years." They remained in the clearing for several more minutes, neither quite ready to break the fragile, wondrous moment that had just passed between them. Eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves, and Damien insisted on personally escorting Elena back to the safety of the castle, his arm remaining protectively around her shoulders the entire journey home. Once safely within the castle walls, Damien immediately called for a private meeting with his most trusted advisors, demanding a full investigation into the attempted ambush. Elena watched from a nearby seat as fury replaced the earlier wonder in his expression, his authority as Alpha King fully reasserting itself now that the immediate danger had passed. "Lord Cassian will answer for this," Damien said, his voice cold and final. "Whatever political ambitions he harbored regarding this pack's future, he has now revealed himself as a genuine threat to the safety of those under my protection. I want him found and brought before this council immediately." "He fled the castle grounds within the hour, Alpha King," one of the guards reported grimly. "His personal belongings were removed from his chambers before your return. It appears he anticipated the possibility of failure." Damien's jaw tightened with barely restrained anger. "Then we will find him wherever he has gone. A man capable of orchestrating an ambush against an innocent woman will not simply disappear and be forgotten. I want every available scout searching the surrounding territories by morning." As the meeting concluded and advisors filed out to begin their preparations, Damien turned back to Elena, his expression softening considerably from the cold fury he had displayed only moments before. "You should rest," he said gently, guiding her toward the door. "Today has already asked far too much of you." "And you?" Elena asked, studying the exhaustion beginning to show beneath his controlled exterior. "What will you do now?" "I will ensure proper security measures are in place throughout the castle," Damien said. "And then, perhaps, I will finally allow myself to sit with whatever has awakened inside me today, rather than immediately pushing it aside for the sake of duty." Elena reached up, gently touching his cheek, feeling the warmth of connection between them growing steadier with each passing moment. "Whatever awakens," she said softly, "know that I am here, whatever form it eventually takes." Damien caught her hand, pressing a gentle kiss against her palm, his gray eyes filled with a warmth and vulnerability that had been entirely absent during their first meeting weeks before. "I am beginning to believe," he said quietly, "that perhaps fate brought you to this castle, for reasons far greater than settling an old family debt." Neither of them yet understood exactly how true those words would prove to be, nor how close Damien stood to finally reclaiming the part of himself that had been missing for far too long. The full moon rose heavy and silver over Blackthorn Castle, 3 nights after the ambush in the forest, and for the first time in longer than Elena had known him, Damien did not retreat alone to his private study to face it in silence. Instead, he requested her presence in the castle's highest tower, a quiet stone chamber open to the night sky, its ancient walls worn smooth by generations of blackthorn alphas who had stood in that same spot to greet the moon's rising light. Elena climbed the winding stairs with a mixture of hope and nervous anticipation, uncertain what the night might bring, but sensing instinctively that something significant was about to occur. She found Damien standing near the tower's open edge, his face tilted upward toward the brightening moon, his hands braced against the ancient stone railing, exactly as she had first found him weeks before. But something about his posture felt different tonight, less like a man bracing for pain, and more like someone standing at the edge of a long-awaited discovery. "Thank you for coming," he said without turning, his voice steady, despite the obvious tension coiled throughout his body. "I did not want to face tonight alone, not after everything that has happened between us these past weeks." Elena moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the warmth of their now familiar connection settling comfortably between them, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "You will not be facing anything alone," she said softly. "Not tonight, and not again, if I have any say in the matter." Damien turned to study her in the pale moonlight, something tender and searching in his gray eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I have never spoken aloud to anyone, not even in the years since my parents died." Elena remained silent, sensing the importance of allowing him space to continue without interruption. "I remember fragments," Damien said, his voice growing rougher with old, buried pain. "Fire, shouting. My mother's voice telling me to run, to hide, that everything would be explained when I was older and safer. I remember waking up 3 days later in a healer's chamber, with no memory of what happened between that night and my recovery. Only this strange, hollow emptiness, where my wolf used to be. I told myself for years that grief alone had somehow silenced him. I never allowed myself to consider that something more deliberate might have occurred." Elena's chest tightened with the weight of the truth she had carried alone for weeks, the Queen's journal still hidden beneath her floorboard, filled with answers Damien desperately needed and deserved to finally hear. She realized, standing beside him beneath the rising moon, that the time for careful caution had finally passed. "There is something I must show you," she said quietly, "something I discovered weeks ago, that I should have told you about far sooner, though I feared what revealing it might mean for both of us." She explained everything then, the journal she had found in his mother's abandoned study, the desperate binding ritual performed to protect him from an ancient family curse, the sacrifice his mother had made in her final days to ensure her son's survival, even at the cost of his connection to his own wolf. Damien listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting through disbelief, grief, and finally, a fragile dawning hope, as the pieces of his fractured memory began fitting together for the first time in 3 long years. "She did this to protect me," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "All this time, I believed I had simply lost something precious through some unexplained failing of my own. I never imagined my mother gave her life, ensuring I would survive long enough to eventually reclaim it. She wrote that only a bond stronger than the curse itself could wake your wolf again," Elena said gently, watching understanding dawn fully across his face. "I believe that bond has been forming between us since the very night we met, Damien. Every kiss, every moment of danger we have faced together, has been slowly weakening whatever barrier your mother placed around your wolf to keep it safe." Damien's hands found hers, gripping tightly, his gray eyes bright with unshed emotion beneath the moon's silver light. "Then let us finish what we started," he said, his voice trembling slightly with hope and fear intertwined. "Whatever happens next, I do not want to face it without you beside me." Elena reached up, gently cradling his face between her palms, feeling the rapid pulse of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. "I am here," she whispered, before closing the distance between them entirely, kissing him with every ounce of certainty and hope she had gathered throughout their weeks together. This time, the response was immediate and overwhelming. A powerful surge of golden light erupted around them, pulsing outward from where their bodies pressed together, illuminating the entire tower chamber, with warmth that seemed to hum with ancient, long-dormant magic finally breaking free. Damien gasped against her lips, his entire body shuddering as 3 years of hollow emptiness finally shattered completely, replaced by a flood of sensation and connection he had feared lost forever. He pulled back, his gray eyes now flickering with flecks of gold, his breathing ragged, as something powerful and long suppressed surged violently to the surface. I feel him, he said, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. My wolf, Elena. He is awake. Before Elena could respond, Damien's body began to shift, bones and muscle rearranging with fluid, practiced ease despite 3 years of dormancy. Until a massive wolf stood before her in the tower chamber, its fur black as midnight, its eyes a striking, familiar gray flecked now with warm streaks of gold. The wolf approached her slowly, almost reverently, pressing its great head gently against her chest, in a gesture of unmistakable recognition and devotion. Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around the massive wolf's neck, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing something far more significant than a simple transformation. She was witnessing a soul made whole again, a bond finally recognized and embraced after years of painful separation. The wolf shifted back into Damien's human form after several long, wondrous minutes, and he immediately pulled Elena into a tight embrace, his entire body trembling with overwhelming emotion. You did this, he said against her hair, his voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. You gave me back the part of myself I feared was lost forever. We did this together, Elena corrected gently, pulling back just enough to meet his gaze, now warmer and more open than she had ever seen it. Your mother protected you long enough for this moment to finally arrive. I merely helped guide you here. Damien's expression grew serious once more, though the warmth in his eyes never fully faded. My wolf recognizes you as his true mate, he said quietly. Not the arrangement forced upon us by old debts and desperate elders, but a bond chosen freely, recognized instinctively, the moment your lips first touched mine during that battle weeks ago. You are not simply a woman paying her family's debt, Elena. You are, and have always been, meant to stand beside me as my true Luna. Elena's heart swelled with an overwhelming rush of emotion, joy and relief, and love finally allowed to surface after weeks of careful restraint. But even amid the wonder of the moment, a small, persistent worry continued nagging at the edges of her happiness. Cassian remained free, his ambitions unresolved, and Elena suspected, with quiet certainty, that the true danger surrounding Damien's family had not yet been fully confronted. Whatever peace they had found beneath the rising moon that night, she understood it was only the beginning of a far larger battle still waiting ahead. News of Damien's restored wolf spread through Blackthorn Castle within a single day, met with celebration from most of the pack, though Elena noticed the careful, calculating silence from a handful of advisors who had clearly hoped his weakened state might continue serving their own hidden purposes. It was General Roland, the aging commander of the pack's warriors, and one of the few advisors who had served faithfully since Damien's father's rule, who finally brought forward the information that would unravel the true depth of the conspiracy surrounding the Blackthorn family. Alpha King, there is something you must see, Roland said grimly, requesting a private audience with Damien and Elena within the castle's council chamber. He unrolled a set of aged documents across the table, his weathered hands trembling slightly with the weight of what he was about to reveal. I found these hidden among old pack records shortly after your parents' death, but feared coming forward at the time, unsure who among the council could be trusted. With your wolf now restored, I believe the time for silence has finally passed. Elena leaned forward alongside Damien, studying the documents carefully. They revealed a long, carefully hidden history, tracing back generations to a betrayal within the Blackthorn Pack's own ranks, an ancestor of the Hale family, who had once attempted to seize control of the pack through treachery, only to be defeated and exiled by Damien's great-grandfather. The resulting curse, placed upon the Blackthorn bloodline by the defeated Hale ancestor in a final act of vengeful magic, had targeted the family's connection to their wolves specifically, weakening each subsequent generation at their most vulnerable moments. Cassian Hale is a direct descendant of the very family responsible for this curse, Roland said grimly. I believe the attack on your parents 3 years ago was not a random act of violence, but a deliberate continuation of that generations-old vendetta, an attempt to finally destroy the Blackthorn bloodline entirely. Damien's expression darkened with a mixture of grief and fury as the pieces of his family's tragic history finally fell into place. My mother knew this, he said quietly, recalling the desperate words from her journal that Elena had shared with him. She protected me the only way she could, sacrificing her own life to ensure the curse could not claim me, as it had claimed my father before her. There is more, Roland continued gravely. My scouts recently located Cassian Hale's whereabouts. He has gathered a small force of mercenaries and disgruntled pack members sympathetic to his cause, currently camped within striking distance of the castle's northern border. I believe he intends to make one final attempt to seize control of this pack, now that his earlier schemes have failed. Damien rose from his seat, his gray eyes blazing with restored authority and determination. Then we will not wait for him to strike first, he said firmly. Gather the warriors, Roland. We end this threat to my family, and this pack once and for all. Elena caught his arm before he could move further, her expression filled with quiet determination. I am coming with you, she said, leaving no room for argument in her tone. Elena, Damien began, concern immediately evident in his voice. I have already proven I will not simply stand aside while danger threatens those I care about, Elena interrupted gently but firmly. Whatever bond exists between us, it goes both directions, Damien. I will not watch you ride into danger alone, not when I might be able to help protect you. Damien studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect her and his growing understanding that Elena was far more capable and determined than his early assumptions about her had ever suggested. Finally he nodded, pulling her close for a brief, fierce embrace. Stay close to me, he said quietly. Whatever happens, we face it together. The confrontation at the northern border unfolded swiftly. Once the Blackthorn warriors arrived, Damien's restored wolf form proving a formidable and decisive advantage against Cassian's hastily assembled forces. Elena remained near the rear of the battle, alongside a small group of healers, though she found herself drawn forward when she spotted Cassian himself attempting to flee the chaos through a narrow forest path, clearly abandoning his mercenaries to face the consequences of his failed rebellion alone. Cassian, Elena called out, blocking his path, despite having no weapon beyond sheer determination. Running will not undo what you have done. Cassian's expression twisted with desperate fury as he realized his escape route was blocked. You have ruined everything, he snarled, advancing toward her with clear intent to remove the obstacle standing between himself and freedom by any means necessary. Generations of careful planning, destroyed because a servant girl managed to awaken a wolf that should have remained buried forever. Before Cassian could close the remaining distance, a powerful black wolf crashed through the surrounding trees, placing itself protectively between Elena and the advancing threat, teeth bared in a warning growl that left no room for further advance. Damien had sensed her danger instinctively, arriving just in time to prevent Cassian from causing any harm. Cassian's remaining courage crumbled at the sight of the restored Alpha King's wolf, and he attempted one final desperate retreat, only to find himself quickly surrounded by Blackthorn warriors who had followed Damien's path through the forest. His mercenary forces, already scattered and defeated throughout the surrounding battlefield, offered no further resistance, leaving Cassian with no remaining options beyond surrender. This is not over, Cassian spat, as warriors bound his hands, dragging him toward the waiting group of prisoners captured during the brief but decisive battle. The curse remains, whether you believe it broken or not. The Blackthorn bloodline will never fully escape what my family set in motion generations ago. Damien, having shifted back into his human form, approached Cassian with quiet, controlled authority, his gray eyes now permanently flecked with warm streaks of gold that spoke to his restored connection with his wolf. The curse has already been broken, he said firmly. Broken not through violence or vengeance, but through a bond your family's ancient magic never accounted for. Love, freely chosen, proves stronger than generations of bitterness and betrayal. Cassian said nothing further, his expression hollow with defeat, as warriors led him away to await formal judgment before the Pack Council. Elena moved to stand beside Damien, watching the last remnants of his family's long, painful history finally reach their resolution. It is truly over, she said softly, still processing the weight of everything revealed over the past several days. It is, Damien confirmed, pulling her close against his side, his relief evident, despite the exhaustion, clearly weighing on him after the day's battle. My family's curse, the shadow that has hung over this pack for generations, finally ends here, today, because of you. Elena leaned into his embrace, watching the last rays of sunset paint the surrounding forest in warm shades of orange and gold. understanding that whatever challenges still lay ahead, the darkest chapter of Damien's story had finally, truly closed. But even as relief settled over the battlefield, Elena understood that one final matter still remained unresolved. A public acknowledgement still owed, before their story could truly move forward into whatever future awaited them both. 3 weeks after the battle at the northern border, Blackthorn Castle prepared for a ceremony far different from the one that had brought Elena there in the first place. The Great Hall had been transformed entirely, the cold, formal atmosphere of her first humiliating arrival, replaced now with warm banners in the pack's colors, flowers gathered from the castle gardens, and the joyful murmur of a pack finally united behind their fully restored Alpha King. Elena stood near the entrance, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation, as Mira made final adjustments to the deep blue gown she wore, so different from the borrowed wedding dress that had brought her nothing but public rejection weeks before. "You look radiant," Mira said warmly, stepping back to admire her handiwork, though I suspect the Alpha King would say the same regardless of what you wore. Elena smiled, though nervousness still fluttered anxiously in her chest. So much had changed since that first devastating day, yet the memory of Damien's public rejection still lingered somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, stubborn scar that today's ceremony would finally begin to heal. Word had traveled swiftly throughout the kingdom regarding the defeat of the Hale conspiracy and the restoration of the Alpha King's wolf, drawing curious and hopeful pack members from every corner of Blackthorn territory to witness what promised to be a historic celebration. Elena's own father, his health finally improving thanks to the healers Damien had generously provided despite the family debt being long since forgiven, sat proudly among the honored guests, tears already gathering in his eyes at the sight of his surviving daughter about to claim a future neither of them had ever dared imagine. The great hall's heavy doors opened precisely as the sun reached its highest point, and Elena walked forward on trembling legs, her eyes immediately finding Damien waiting at the front of the assembled crowd. He stood tall and proud in formal attire befitting his position, though his gray eyes, now permanently warmed with flecks of gold, held none of the cold distance from their first meeting. Instead, they shone with open adoration that made Elena's nervous heart settle into steady, joyful certainty with every step she took toward him. When she finally reached his side, Damien reached for her hands, his expression turning solemn and sincere as he addressed the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Weeks ago, in this very hall, I made a grave mistake," he began, his gaze never leaving Elena's face. "I looked at a woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her family and her people, and I saw only an unwanted obligation forced upon me by circumstances beyond my control. I told her, in front of this entire pack, that she would never be my Luna." He paused, emotion thickening his voice as he continued. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd as Damien continued, recounting for those who had not already heard the full story, how Elena's courage, kindness, and unwavering determination had ultimately broken the ancient curse that had haunted his family for generations, restoring not only his lost wolf, but the very heart he had believed, permanently hardened by grief and loss. "Elena Voss did not come to this castle seeking a crown," Damien said, turning fully to face her, his expression filled with a warmth and vulnerability the entire pack had never before witnessed from their carefully guarded Alpha King. "She came seeking only to protect the people she loved, and in doing so, she gave me back everything I believed lost forever, my wolf, my family's legacy, and a heart I feared had grown too cold to ever love again." Elena felt tears sliding freely down her cheeks now, overwhelmed by the depth of sincerity in his words, so different from the cold rejection that had once shattered her pride in this very same hall. Damien knelt before her then, a gesture no Alpha King had offered within living memory, drawing a collective gasp of astonishment from the assembled crowd. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly threatening to overwhelm him, "I was wrong to reject you weeks ago, and I have spent every day since trying to prove myself worthy of the second chance you so generously offered me, regardless of my earlier cruelty. I do not ask you to become my Luna out of duty, or debt, or ancient arrangement forced upon either of us. I ask you because I love you, completely and without reservation, and because my wolf recognized in you a bond stronger than any curse or crown could ever break." Will you stand beside me? Not as an obligation fulfilled, but as a partner freely chosen. Elena's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady and clear despite the tears still streaming down her face. Yes, she said, pulling him gently to his feet, before wrapping her arms around him fully in front of the entire celebrating pack. I choose you too, Damien. Not the crown, not the title, but you. The great hall erupted into joyful celebration, the pack's collective relief and happiness echoing off ancient stone walls that had witnessed generations of Blackthorn history, both triumphant and tragic. As the formal mating ceremony proceeded beneath the golden afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, Elena felt the same warm, powerful energy she had experienced during their earlier kisses settle permanently between them, a bond now fully recognized, celebrated, and unbreakable. That evening, as the celebration continued below in the castle grounds, Damien led Elena once more to the highest tower, the same quiet chamber where his wolf had first fully awakened weeks before. The full moon hung bright and silver above them, its light no longer a source of pain and hollow absence, but instead, a gentle, welcoming presence, reflecting the peace finally settled within him. Do you feel it? Damien asked softly, pulling her close, as they both gazed upward at the glowing moon. I feel it, Elena confirmed, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, contented rhythm of his heartbeat. Whole, complete, exactly as it should be. Damien pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead, his voice filled with quiet, unshakable certainty, as he spoke his final promise beneath the moonlit sky. Whatever challenges the future brings, Elena, we face them together, as true equals, bound not by ancient debts or forgotten curses, but by a love we chose freely for ourselves. Below them, the castle continued its joyful celebration long into the night, the pack finally whole and united, behind an alpha king who had reclaimed not only his wolf, but his heart. All because a woman he once swore would never be his Luna had refused to let him face his deepest wounds alone. And beneath that same bright, forgiving moon, their story, finally freed from the shadows of the past, began its truest chapter yet.